Good afternoon from Columbus, Ohio, which is the traditional homelands of the Shawnee, Potawatomi, Delaware, Miami, Peoria, Seneca, Wyandotte, Ojibwe, and Cherokee peoples. I'm Stephen John Quaye, and I'm an associate professor in the Higher Education and Student Affairs program at The Ohio State University. Thank you so much for joining us for the second conversation in the ASHE Presidential Webinar series, convened by current ASHE President D.L. Stewart. This webinar is being captioned live, and those captions can be accessed by clicking the CC button in your menu bar. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available on the ASHE website in the next week. Throughout the webinar, you can pose questions to the panelists by using the Q&A feature in the menu bar. They may answer questions throughout as they come in or at the end. The purpose of the ASHE Presidential Webinar series is to engage leaders on critical issues about equity related to space and place in higher education. Let me distinguish between place and space. According to Eric Jacobson, places are imbued with memories and experiences, whereas spaces are blank states that have yet to be transformed into places and may, in fact, never morph into places. Places help us develop our identities, but spaces give us the space, so to speak, to reflect on what is possible with our identities. We need both places and spaces. The campus borders of community colleges and minority-serving institutions have often transcended into their local communities and neighborhoods. In this second webinar, I invited 4 leaders to discuss the possibilities of crossing the borders of place and space to live in relationship with neighborhoods and local communities. Jacqueline Mack is a visiting assistant professor in the Counseling and Higher Education Department at Northern Illinois University. Her work focuses on racialized campus environments, institutional transformation toward equity, and higher education access policies with a particular interest in minority-serving institutions. Nadrea Njoko is a senior research associate at the Frederick D. Patterson Research Institute of UNCF. She uses a critical race and feminist lens in order to disrupt race and gender within the post-secondary education context in the Institute's research agenda. Her work centers on guided pathways and student success. Symphony Oxendine is an assistant professor of higher education at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Her work focuses on the social and institutional issues that affect American Indians and other underrepresented groups, as well as historically Native American fraternities and sororities, and the institutional and political processes that serve as barriers for students with minoritized identities. And last but not least, Ebony Zamani Gallagher is a professor of higher education and community college leadership and director of the Office for Community College Research and Leadership at the University of Illinois. Her research broadly focuses on minoritized student populations in marginalized institutional contexts with a particular focus on access, broadening participation, and equitable post-secondary educational trajectories for students in 2- and 4-year institutions. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm looking forward to today's conversation. Before I pose the first question, I want to ask each panelist to briefly say hello, recognize where you're joining from, and share anything you want us to know about you and your work. Let's start with you, Jackie.
Thanks, Stephen, for that introduction. I'm connecting today from the ancestral and unceded lands of the Kickapoo, Peoria, Kaskakia, Potawatomi, Miami, Ho-Chunk, and Sioux peoples, what we now may refer to as Chicago, Illinois. I think it's important for the audience to know that I am a Southeast Asian American woman, a daughter of refugees. I am a part of the Seaster Scholars Collective, spelled S-E-A-A-S-T-E-R, which is a collective of Southeast Asian American practitioners, researchers, and educators who use a feminist refugee epistemology to advance knowledge and understanding of the post-secondary education experiences of C students, staff, and faculty. It's also important for the audience to know that much of who I am and what I do today is heavily influenced by my ability to have taken Asian American Studies courses earlier on in my educational career and the agents who advanced that curriculum, which gave me a space to explore myself and the skills that I have since used to view my family, my community as the center of my work. And so I bring these collectives and community members with me in the work that I do now.
Thank you, Jackie. Ebony, why don't you go next?
Thanks, Stephen. Good afternoon, all. I am at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and as a land-grant institution, it's important that I acknowledge that I am currently on the lands of the Peoria, the Kaskaskia, the Wea, the Miami, the Muscoutin, the Odawa, the Suk, the Miskawi, the Kickapoo, the Potawatomi, the Chickasaw, and the Ojibwe nations. I wanted to also share that it is a necessary acknowledgement that these Native nations and for us to work with them as we move forward as an institution has been something that we endeavor to do. And so over the next several years, there will still be a move to try to have more inclusion of all of our differences. And Illinois seeks to have Native peoples at the core of its efforts.
Great, thank you, Ebony. Symphony, let's go to you next.
All right. Hello, everyone. Again, I am Symphony Oxendine. I am Cherokee and Choctaw. I'm originally from Tulsa, Oklahoma, but I'm joining you today from Robeson County, North Carolina, the seat and home of the Lumbee Nation, where my husband and I live and raise our 2 daughters who are enrolled citizens of the Lumbee Nation. I would also like to acknowledge that the institution I work at, the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, is located on the traditional territory of the Catawba people and has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst many indigenous peoples over the last 12,000 years before this state was what we now know it as North Carolina. I want to honor and respect the diverse indigenous peoples that are connected to this land that we now occupy. Thank you.
Thanks, Symphony. And Nadrea.
Hi, everybody. Nadrea here. I am a senior research associate at FDPRI at UNCF, as Stephen mentioned. However, my work is concentrated inside of our Atlanta offices, which is, I want to acknowledge the native lands of the Cherokee and Muskogee people. I also want to take time to acknowledge that Atlanta, Georgia, Georgia itself was a space where people were enslaved in order to develop that land, and people continue to be displaced through gentrification in the city that I occupy. I think it's also very important for everyone here in the audience to understand that the perspectives that I will bring to this conversation is primarily centered in my walk and experience of a daughter of a woman who went to college at the age of 35 and therefore brought her daughter to class with her constantly. I was in class, babysitted by the deans and professors of an HBCU. I attended way too many HBCU parade and homecomings as a little girl. And so it's only natural that my work and my service to my community happens as a researcher of historically Black colleges and universities and the Black women that occupy their campus.
Thank you so much. I think it's a really good jumping off point, Nadrea, about the story you just shared, about the importance of the connection to the local communities and the village that it takes for doing this kind of work. So I really appreciate you sharing that with us. So I want to kick off this first question in the following way. So the focus of this session is on community colleges and minority serving institutions as well as the unique needs of students within these contexts. So to help the audience understand these particular contexts and students, I want each of you to talk about 1 or 2 lessons you've learned from your work in these areas. Ebony, let's start with you.
Sure. I guess for me, a couple lessons that I would share is the fact that, well, one thing is a lot of people still readily discount community colleges, when in fact over 2/5 of all undergraduates enrolled in college today are at 2-year institutions. Another thing I guess I would share is that more often than not, as people think about MSI context, that another area of overlooking for community colleges is within that realm. When we think about the community colleges, they are not necessarily thought of relative to MSI designation, when in fact, nearly half of all MSIs are community colleges, you know, so when you get to well over 2/5 rather of community colleges being MSIs and community colleges educating over 2/5 of undergraduates, and you know, the fact that we have this disconnect in terms of representation of the learner and who's in the instructional core, who is in positions of authority, who is represented on these institutions' boards, they do not readily reflect that of you know, racially minoritized folk that are attending these institutions by and large. And so that's something that I guess I would share and impress upon folks as we think about these credentialing pathways, that the primary door seal for much of post-secondary for many folks of color are community colleges, and many of which are minority serving ones.
Thank you so much for that, Ebony. Najera, why don't you go next?
Sure, sorry, it's always a task to make sure I'm on unmute myself. So for me, the first lesson that we can talk about when we talk about, specifically for me, for HBCUs, are that they are vanguards of innovation. These institutions are part and parcel and like an embodiment of the reasons why they were founded. So one of my favorite popular press books about HBCUs is entitled "I'll Find a Way to Make One." And so for me, that speaks to the founding of HBCUs and their ability to constantly innovate to produce the right conditions for success. And the second lesson, and we'll get into this more, I think, in our conversation, is that they're of higher education to the community through HBCUs. HBCUs have declarations, or it's a part of their it's a social contract to the community to develop that community and educate, not only just educate, but help to bolster and lift the community through their existence. And we'll talk more about the commitment to the community and HBCUs, their relationship to that. But for me, it's always vanguards of innovation and a commitment to the community.
Thank you for that. Symphony, what thoughts do you have to this question?
Thank you. So I feel like one of the biggest lessons that I've learned kind of through my journey is this invisibility that we're really trying to fight in terms of Indigenous and Native students, especially when we talk about you know, non-Native colleges and universities, which Heather Schotten, Shelley Lowe, and Stephanie Waterman coined the term to talk about institutions that are not tribal colleges or universities, because I realize that a lot of professionals in higher education think that Native students are only going to tribal colleges and that we're not at all the other institutions. So whether it's a minority serving institution or a Native American serving non-tribal institution, community colleges, wherever, this idea that we're either not there, or we're so small of a we're not a critical mass, so that we really struggle with getting folks to understand that we are here, and that even if you only have a handful of students, that those students matter, and that we are still responsible for making sure that those students have everything that they need to be successful in our institutions. And so the work that has come out in terms of Indigenous research from Indigenous scholars in the last 2 decades, especially coming up on recognizing that we're really fighting against and asking higher education to start recognizing that we are here, and that though we may not be a significant number, however you term that, in all the ways that you could term significance, we matter and we're here. And so, for me, that's probably one of the biggest reasons why I continue to do the work that I do, and that our communities are calling for us to have our students' needs met and be successful, so that they can go back and give back to the community when they're, successful and graduating from our institutions.
Appreciate that, Symphony. Thank you so much. And finally, Jackie.
I echo what the other panelists have said. With my response of the lesson that I've learned from my work is that MSIs, including community colleges and four-year colleges, 2-year and 4-year institutions, MSIs have so much wisdom to offer other institutional types. There's so much learning, so much innovation, so much deep grappling and work that can be shared. Apologies for the side noise. I live on a main street, so we hear lots of that noise. What I want to amplify here is that what I learned was that there's so many institutional agents at many MSIs that have long been deeply grappling with what it means to serve a particular population of students beyond a federal designation, beyond federal funding. And that many of these individuals at these institutions have long been doing so before even the MSI designation or federal funding came around. And so what I've learned is that there's so much more to the story that we tell or don't tell about MSIs in our field. I'm gonna keep my response fairly brief because I know I'm talking again soon.
Thanks for that, Jackie. So I really appreciate these lessons. I would love to just reiterate one thing that stood out to me that each of the panelists said before I move on to the next question, just so folks really take home the powerful information that was just shared. So this question again is about the lessons that the panelists have learned in their work. One of the things that Ebony said was that 2/5 of all students enrolled today are at 2-year institutions. So, that's 40%, right, of the students who are enrolled. And so that's a very important population for us to think about, but yet the boards often don't reflect who the students are, right? So I think that's one thing that stood out to me from Ebony. Nadrea talked about HBCUs as the vanguards of innovation, and that they really embody, the ways that they were founded, which is, an alliance to the community to serve the people, right? And then with Symphony, it's around this invisibility of Native students, right? That they're not just at tribal institutions, but they're on all of our campuses, and how do we show them that they matter? And then I thought Jackie built off Nadrea's point powerfully when she said MSIs have so much wisdom to offer other institutional types, but yet, the institutional agents at these institutions were often the ones who've been always doing this work, which reminds me a lot of, former ASHE President Estela Ben-Simon when she gave her presidential address around the importance of practitioner knowledge, which we don't often pay attention to. So I just appreciate you raising that point, Jackie. So we're going to stick with you, Jackie, for this next question. So I know one of your research areas of interest is focused specifically on Anapisis. Can you tell the audience what this acronym means and some highlights of what you found in your research? Yeah, I'm glad you asked this question because I get the question a lot about what the acronym means. And unfortunately, it's not as short or succinct as what we have time for, but I'll try my best. Anapisis, sometimes pronounced as Anapisis. I don't have a camp on that. That's just the 2 ways you may hear it pronounced. The acronym itself means Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander Serving
serving institutions. Where the "and" is placed in that title is very important. And that's where I think a lot of confusion happens. And so I oftentimes refer folks to look back at the legislation itself. The legislation defines Asian American and then Native American Pacific Islander, which the legislation defines as any descendant of the Aboriginal people of any island in the Pacific Ocean that is a territory or possession of the United States. There's a lot going on with that definition, and we don't have time to unpack it. The point I want to make is that we don't always really know where the definition came from. I've tried to dig into this. I know some colleagues who are tuning into this webinar have also tried to dig into kind of where this language came from. And where we landed is that it emerged from a US House and Senate conference session after some sort of AAPI serving institution legislation was passed, and that this was the name that they came out with. And so when I talk about Anapisis, or when I kind of loosely talk about them, I usually refer to them as AAPI serving institutions, since the phrasing of Native American Pacific Islander didn't necessarily come from the community or the advocates who were trying to establish this legislation and designation. And so I'll try to quickly share kind of two lessons or two highlights from my research that is, I think, exciting and interesting to our conversation today. And the first is the context from which Anapisis emerged as a federal designation. Oftentimes we don't really dig into kind of the origin stories of some of these forces and legislation that are huge levers in our work today. But the earliest conversations came to create this designation, not from higher education folks, some higher education folks in terms of practitioners, but it largely came from community-based organizations, policymakers who kind of straddled this line between policymaker and community member, advocates and other community members. And specifically, it came from people who worked directly with local community members who had access to stories of lived experiences, locally collected data that really told the story that current policies really weren't serving particular ethnic subgroups within the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities. And so in particular, when we kind of dig back into the history, we see Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander community members who were the catalysts, who were the drivers of this conversation, because they saw an opportunity to shift the federal policy to create some sort of AAPI serving designation so that they can apply for and access the types of material resources they needed to better support their communities. And these community members were largely impacted by war, imperialism, and colonization. And so that's a story I think that doesn't get told a lot. And I think it's really important as we try to understand Anapisis as a whole, but how that designation is rooted in a lot of community-based activism. The second lesson or highlight I'll share refers back to what I just shared earlier, which is how the work to serve a particular population of students long existed before there was a broader MSI designation. And for me, this came through working with and studying Anapisis. And one of the ways that change agents at these institutions have worked to better serve AAPI students is through fostering, as best as they can, an academic curriculum that actually reflected that student or that population or their communities or their histories, and the tools that they would need to navigate and figure out what life meant in these contexts. So I'll give an example. I think a lot about the faculty and staff at UMass Boston, who developed a robust Asian American Studies program east of California. That's a really important reference point, east of California, in the 1980s. To better serve the changing demographics of the Asian American population in Boston at that time, which was largely increasingly becoming Southeast Asian, first gen, Vietnamese, included low income students with refugee backgrounds. And when we actually create the space to hear the stories, we hear stories of first gen Vietnamese refugee students who went to UMass Boston, who studied in their Asian American Studies program, who participated in their community engagement programs, and then went back to their school communities to be teachers and school leaders and future educators, some of whom who stayed at UMass Boston to become future educators there. And some of their children are now attending UMass Boston because of that curriculum, because of an opportunity to engage in that type of learning that they might not be able to get elsewhere. And it's in part because of a consistent community focus that the program takes on, because that community space and place is where lots of the students, including many of the staff and faculty, still live. And to kind of bring it back to kind of the Anapisis MSI designation conversation, just looking at reality, for as long as I've been alive, there's been a robust Asian American Studies program at UMass Boston. But the school has only had Anapisis funding and designation since 2008, right? So for 2 decades before the designation even came around, before additional funding came around, they were already doing this work. And so what does that mean for us? It means that when the work of the MSI is actually focused on serving the students, not just securing a status that can be positioned, not just securing funding that can just be leveraged, the existing work at those institutions that have always been under-resourced by the institution, possibly our field, or in our field in general, that work actually has a better chance of thriving and also making an even bigger difference in the lives of those student populations.
Thank you for that, Jackie. I appreciate it. A couple of things stood out to me as you were sharing. One was this notion of the territory or possession of the U.S., right? And so I think a lot of the word possession, like ownership and who decides who owns things. I mean, it dates back to, imperialism, colonization, all the things that you said. And then also the importance of like labels, like how sometimes these labels that were not created by certain populations or us are used still as a way to gain some sort of recognition, right? So to me, those are 2 pieces that really stood out to me. I'm going to go to you next, Symphony, because I think you can build off a lot of what Jackie said too, in regards to Native students. Like, so we know that they're not a monolithic group, right? And you named some of that at the beginning about their invisibility. So can you tell us what particular challenges they face in the college context and what they need from us as educators?
Yeah, so, the first thing that jumped out to me about this question is that I think we need to stop assuming that educators know that Native and Indigenous people are not a monolithic group. So as someone who teaches in a student affairs or a higher education preparation program, there's so many times that I just come up against this notion that, maybe it might be better to say that perhaps conceptually we know to say that they're not a monolithic group because that's what society tells us to say, but practitioners don't know how to actualize that in practice, right? So when I read this question, I was like, oh, well, we, first let's really tackle that assumption and see, is it actually being practiced? And then, definitely for Native and Indigenous students, identity is so complex and complicated, broadly speaking, that when you think of, all of these unique tribal nations and communities that our students come with, each having their own language, culture, traditions, spirituality practices, histories, and then you add in, as we were just talking about, the possession, the political and legal kind of aspects of identity for Native and Indigenous people, like that monolithic group feels more comfortable, I think, for a lot of our educators because they don't know how to even begin to start tackling this huge complex identity of this group, right? And so, when you get down then more to the more personal level of the student, right, is then you have to realize that each student you're working with identifies themselves within all of those aspects uniquely on this huge continuum, right? And that has so many kind of implications from whether you're federally recognized, whether you're enrolled in a tribe, whether were raised in your home community with your language, your dialect, with your traditional cultures, in the people that you come from or not, that, all of those, when you break it down, I think oftentimes feel so unobtainable for people to even begin to understand that it is a barrier for many of us to try to kind of combat that. And then you have our students coming to these campuses where there's this huge cultural disconnect, that our institutions are rooted in Western colonial systems, right, that expect them to assimilate in order to be successful. And, many times we have individuals who don't recognize that colonization is both past and present, that it is still exists, as Jackie just said, and you pointed out, it's still happening today. Possession still exists legally and politically in our system. So, our students are really kind of having all of this stuff. And, we know the research, we know the challenges. So your second part of this question is, so what do we do about it, right? And I love where this takes us because, those campuses where culture and Indigenous knowledge is valued and centered as a strength for our students is where you will see more successful students because they're allowed to use their culture as an anchor and overcome all those challenges that we've been reading about for so long, right? And then I think the next thing I would say that educators really need to do is, it's simple to say, and it's really hard to do, is educate yourself about Native Indigenous people first. There's so many good books that have come out from Indigenous scholars in the last 20 years that give you a good broad overview, but then you need to go deeper and you need to learn about the community that you're occupying, that you're working at, and each of the students' tribal nations that they're representing, because all of those students have their unique identity and their value systems. And if you want to see how microcosms of environments work, put a whole bunch of Native students from different tribes in a room and try to point out where you see everyone agreeing on the same thing. Like that's not how it really works, right? There's similarities, but you're going to see a whole lot of unique and diverse experiences coming in there. And don't expect the students to teach you. You need to be teaching yourself. That's part of this cultural competence that we talk about, but is really hard to enact, is that you have to do the work yourself and then go out and start engaging your students in what is their lived experience and how does that take that knowledge you've read and actually make it into real life experience. And the last thing I would say is I would highly recommend that every institution and practitioner get the new Indigenous Student Affairs CAS standards that just came out and start looking at ways that you can implement those CAS standards in your whole institution as really a way to assist you in creating or expanding programs and services that you're using to reach to your Indigenous students, because this is really the first time we've had a one all-encompassing, as much as possible that we could as a group create what it would look like to have a promising practice, if you will, of ways you can serve students.
Thank you so much for that, Symphony. There was a lot of labor in your response, and so I just want to acknowledge and offer my gratitude for that. You're pushing me, I'll speak for myself personally, to really grapple with the nuance, right? I think we live in the land where we want, best practices or concrete suggestions. And the reality is those best practices and concrete suggestions don't exist because people are not simple. And I think you encourage us to really deal with the complexity, which I think is a really powerful way. So I appreciate that. One of the aspects of community colleges and minority serving institutions is that their campus borders often transcend into their local communities and neighborhoods, which we've talked about earlier. Nadrea, I'm wondering if you can discuss potential ways people within these institutions can cross the borders of place and space to live in relationship with neighborhoods and local communities. What are some examples of what that might look like?
Absolutely. I think that this conversation at first has just been really, amazing. There are a lot of things that pockets of information I would love to hit on. I do want to mention the idea of wisdom that these institutions hold. FDPRI has a report that came out a few years ago entitled Imparting Wisdom, which takes lessons from the HBCU environments and imparts that wisdom to the K through 12 experience. And we're hoping to expand on that idea of the wisdom that we can find at historically Black colleges and universities to impart to broader higher education, or the environment of higher education. And then I really loved what Symphony was talking about, the idea that we are not a monolith. that you can go to each of these MSIs, community colleges, and it will not be a homogeneous experience. You know, everyone isn't just a cookie cutter outline of Blackness, nativeness. You know, we don't have Hispanic serving institutions represented on the panel exactly, but you know, HSIs in themselves, you could get into the politics of that and the nuances of having different cultures in one space, and how do you navigate it? In relationship to your question, Stephen, I think I mentioned earlier about how HBCUs are innately tied to their immediate and wider community. And, you know, one of the things that I love so much about the HBCU campus, depending on where you are, if you're in an urban setting, most often the HBCU that you travel to is going to exist inside of an urban neighborhood or residential neighborhood, where you could look across the street or out of your classroom window and see that community, the organism of the community existing. You know, you could see mothers and fathers and children existing. A lot of HBCUs have community schools attached to them. One example of how this happens, I'll pull from my own experience as a student at Xavier University of Louisiana, is that our school itself is not closed in, there's no border, and we're inside of a neighborhood. So I distinctly remember going from the administration building at Xavier, where there, you know, one part of the campus has particular types of classes, but we would go to Xavier South, which is 2 or 3, you know, street blocks down for business classes and community classes. And on the way there, we would stop at the candy lady's house and buy candy, buy snacks, frozen cups of Hucklebucks, depending on, you know, what your orientation is in New Orleans. I mean, we existed, you know, intrinsically inside the neighborhood. There were people whose grandmothers lived. They would stop at their grandmother's house and take a nap or watch a television show on in between classes. You know, these schools in the urban setting are a part of the community, and there's no ignoring that. And I think that the wisdom that we can draw from them is that we could name countless flagship institutions, urban, traditionally white, historically white institutions that have literally stolen the land by eminent domain to build institutions. So getting rid of all the richness that Symphony talked about, just wiping it and sweeping it clean and then building their big, huge institutional structures. Whereas I can speak to HBCUs, but I'm sure the same is true for all MSIs. They exist within and in, you know, in consort or you know, in relationship to. They are richer because of the neighborhoods that they exist inside of. I'll draw from Xavier and Dillard, in that Xavier and Dillard for years had a relationship with the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. It's an independent organization now, but for years they had institutional sponsorships with Xavier or Dillard. And they have training for how to get rid of chemicals or pollution in a neighborhood. They train community members and college students, for that matter, to basically do the environmental justice that the government, state, local, federal should be doing. They're training their community members to do that. So you see community organizations existing in those spaces and because of those spaces. And then we could talk about Paul Quinn College, which is a working college in Dallas, Texas. It is the first new urban college model where they, in order to reduce the price of tuition and cut down on debt, so students will graduate with no less than $10,000 of a bill or debt. Their students work as a part of their tuition, right? And then if we speak to rural HBCUs, those institutions within themselves are epicenters for those communities, right? They not only are the community centers, the employer, the cultural train stops where intellectuals for history have stopped, right? You could probably map W.E.B. Du Bois's travels around the United States by going to different HBCUs to speak, right? Those things are happening, but they're also contributors to educating those communities that are immediate and around their locale. So those are examples of how it looks. It could look as easy as going to the candy lady store, or learning how to, basically get rid of the chemicals that are having environmental issues within your community. You can touch those community organizations, or you could just be a part of the epicenter of a community by being a member of that institutional structure or ecosystem.
Thank you so much for that. The word that I keep thinking about as all of you are talking so far, and Symphony has named this a couple of times, is this notion of assimilation. And I think a lot about when a community when a college exists, as Nigeria pointed out, in the community that students live in, I think it's likely harder to reinforce that notion of assimilation in some ways, because you're invested in those communities and those are the people who you're with and so you're surrounded by. So again, I don't want to pretend that it still doesn't exist, or that these are like romanticize the notion of these partnerships in that way. But I just kept thinking about that as you were speaking, Andrea. Ebony, I want to bring you into this conversation too in relationship to this question, and I'm gonna add another some more nuance and complexity onto this for you, Ebony, as well too. So I want you to answer the previous question, but then I also want you to bring in this notion of regional publics, because we haven't really talked about that particular institutional type yet. In some ways, I think they deserve some attention here too. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that particular institutional type and what we can learn about the work of students and educators also within regional publics.
Right. One thing I want to touch on just real quickly, and it's related to what Nadrea was sharing. She made mention of historically Black colleges and universities that are in rural contexts. And I think sometimes what's also overlooked, is how community colleges are often in rural communities, and they are the lifeblood of those communities, just as they are in urban communities, right? But that community colleges, in terms of the connection to the communities locally, help drive opportunity, right? And so a lot of times it's this notion, in Illinois, we talk about going local to go far, right? Or staying local to go far. And so the extent to which you're provided access to higher education, and that within those respective communities, they are hubs, right? And again, the lifeline to information, to personal development, workforce training, cultural development, you name it. But, when we think about community colleges in particular, they are what we call a uniquely American kind of invention, in that the community, while it started out as the junior college movement, the community was always a centerpiece, because they are units of local government. And, you only succeed as a college when you are responsive to the needs of those communities that you serve, and that every resident in every state is to be served by a community college, right? And oftentimes you're represented by elected official, right, within that community college district. So I just wanted to say, something along the lines of that, in the sense that there's a way in which community colleges have been a bottom-up type of development, and having grown out of extension high schools within local communities to now consisting of, community college districts. shows that inextricable link with community. Now to the add-on question of, regional institutions in terms of, their role within communities. I think that there's, again, a way in which there's a overlooked or undervalued way in which, regional comprehensive public institutions are regarded. We have a lot of, particularly public, universities that are top public schools that are doing great things in terms of research, in terms of, the public service and community engagement, quality instruction, teaching and learning, where in many regards they are aiming to elevate those within their respective local and, again, from a larger kind of sphere across the state and neighboring states, needs. And so I think that, oftentimes with kind of the typical pedigree kind of conversations that happen, that sometimes folks undervalue the value within public colleges and universities that are regional institutions. They, like community colleges, many times can have students that merit a profile community college, and that they may be commuter institutions. And so they may have more accessible missions in terms of their admissions policies, as well as discounted tuition for residents, right, within the state. And that there are ways in which how they're funded often help the local community relative to the subsidies in terms of tax dollars and the like that they help to generate when you have a regional comprehensive institution. And so I think sometimes people think that thinking about national ratings, that's better than going to a regional, but not necessarily. If you take a good look at the programs, if you think about issues around accreditation and what might be more readily transferable in terms of transfer receptive cultures between 2 and 4 year, I think that regional institutions can also be difference makers as well.
Thank you for that, Ebony, and for bringing in the regional institutions into this discussion as well. I think that helps. Again, the whole point of today, I think, is, I love words. And so I often have words of the day. And so I feel like I have 3 so far right now. But I keep coming back to nuance, right? And I think the more we add nuance, complexity, it strengthens our ability, I think, to work with each other. So I appreciate you adding some more nuance to the discussion. We have just a few more minutes remaining. So I'm going to pause here and see if there's any questions from those who are joining us in the audience. So I'm going to pause a moment. If not, then I'm going to ask the closing question to the panelists. But I just want to pause here and see if there's any questions. So don't be shy. Please post them in the chat box or use the Q&A. Okay, so I'm very comfortable with silence, but this is also a webinar that's being recorded. So I'm not gonna wait as long as I usually do in my classes. So we're gonna get to the final question for the panelists. So the last question that I have, and this is gonna go against something that I said a little bit earlier today. So I just said, I don't do top 10 lists or have or best practices or concrete suggestions. And yet I do want you to talk a little bit about not a top 10 list, but each of you to share what is 1 or 2 takeaways that you want the audience to leave with based on today's session. So again, just 1 or 2 takeaways from today. We're gonna start with you, Symphony.
All righty then. So I think I could have used a little more silence. Okay, so thanks, Stephen. I would have, so I think in terms of the crossing borders, one of the things, and this is kind of something I didn't get to mention, is when we talk about how to really engage in relationships between institutions and the communities, especially when you're talking about institutions that are located in areas for us where there are tribal nations, is really thinking about how, as institutions, when we're trying to approach other communities, that we need to go into those with, I would say, an understanding that we don't know everything. And for academics, that's really hard for us because we've gotten to where we are because we know things, right? But especially in the work that we've seen, it's really hard for institutions to create relationships with tribal communities because they want to come in a transactional kind of way instead of a relational or reciprocal way, and coming in ready to listen and to hear what the community needs from the institutions. And I think those are the opportunities that higher education practitioners and administrators are really failing to kind of take, is going in with long-term work that's going to need to be done to create credible, authentic, legitimate relationships with communities that we're in. Means that you need to come in and you need to let go of being the expert and listen and hear what the people who are the people we serve need from us, and take those opportunities.
Ooh, yeah, we need to let go. I think that that is so hard for us, Symphony. So thank you for that takeaway that you wanted to share. Ebony, let's go to you next.
I guess for me, I would say for people to revisit their assumptions, many of which can be value-laden as it relates to what might be deemed special pops colleges. So whether it's community colleges, whether it's MSIs, and again, a great share of MSIs are actually what we call in our shop MSCCs, minority serving community colleges, to think about what have been the traditional models of the educational journey for post-secondary, and what has been valued, and who has been valued, and who benefits and who doesn't, and the underlying beliefs about what the value proposition is for the various types of institutions, and the degree pathways with which they offer. And so I think there's a lot of things that are inhibitors to opportunities that continue to perpetuate the opportunity gaps, particularly racialized inequities in terms of, thinking through one's in, through, and out story. And so I would just say, as a takeaway, for folks to sit with that, to wrestle with that, and to think outside the box, color outside the lines in terms of some more human-centered methods around how we think about the design of and how we identify problems and assign value to institutions and those that they serve. Because for me, community colleges have often been, what I consider a maverick, in that they created the massification of higher education. Notwithstanding, they still have equity gaps that have to be addressed as it relates to racial, ethnic gaps and others. But still, for us to really problematize the design in terms of the systems to chip away at what is more structural and systemic status quo.
Great, thank you so much, Ebony. I appreciate that. Nadrea.
I'm glad you called me next, because that was a great segue to my takeaway. I'm going to take the equity evaluation and assessment perspective in in relationship to my position at FDPRI. I want to say that every research approach is not made equal and is not always equitable. And so when we're talking about MSIs, community colleges, particularly since these are the spaces that students of color often occupy, that we don't approach them from the same kinds of ways of evaluation or in order to cross the borders, like like DL's theme for this year's conference, the theme here for this session. In order to cross those borders, we have to do things differently, and we have to use research, evaluation, and assessment practices and approaches that fit the students, populations, and institutions that we want to examine, to lift up the goodness and the challenges that we want to, analyze. But we also have to do use practices that center their voices, right? So if we continue to use practices that put them at the margins, they will always be at the margins. We will always look at these institutions as less than. We will always say they need to do better, they need to do more. But if we center them and the voices and the people that they serve, we will often find that they are succeeding above and beyond the institutions we always center, which are the traditionally white, historically white institutions. They won't be at the center of practice, the center of the best, the center of good, but rather they will actually move to the margins, and MSIs will move to the center as places that we can draw wisdom from. And to keep it short, I'll put a report that FDPRI recently released about that actual topic. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Andrea. And finally, let's go to you, Jackie.
Worse than creating these lists is to go last. But I think what I'm about to share, I think connects well with what the wisdom that everyone else has already shared, and connects back to one of the words of your day, Stephen, about nuance. And I offer, and something that I think about a lot, is to consider what our role is in reinforcing or disrupting the stories we tell or don't tell about these spaces and places we foster and or inhabit. Are we being gatekeepers of places and spaces, and gatekeepers of the stories we tell and don't tell? As we've all really tried to share and get just a little bit into this conversation, is that there are indeed stories and narratives and forces that are oftentimes ignored, not told, invisibilized, etc. And it's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. And I've personally found myself incredibly humbled and thinking about new perspectives to me by being curious about how things came to be the way they are, and by constantly and increasingly trying to understand the additional nuances and complexities of the stories and histories, both the ones that are told and untold. So that's my ask of, oh yes, and I want this captured for the video, and Andrea mentioned secrets. Right? What are secrets that are told or untold? What are secrets we tell to protect others and to reinforce the systems?
Thank you so much. Thank you all for your really bold, powerful perspectives, for sharing space with us today. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm sure that DL appreciates it too. So just want to say thank you from both of us for the time that you've invested today. So thank you, Andrea, Jackie, Symphony, and Ebony for such a stimulating conversation for this second ASHE Presidential Webinar. As a reminder, these webinars will be occurring bi-monthly, and we have 2 more remaining, with the next one on August 12th, where panelists will discuss what equity and justice look like in sustainability education. So again, my gratitude to the panelists for today, and to DL Stewart for convening these, and I hope you all have a good rest of the day, everyone. And again, thanks so much for attending.